Hi there, it's me, Finn. And tonight we're going to talk about something a little cold, a little quiet, and strangely calming. You see, when people think of the medieval world, they often picture castles, knights, and grand feasts. But what they don't often imagine is the biting cold that seeped into every inch of life for months on end. You wouldn't believe how little it took for winter to become a slow battle, not with swords or shields, but with hunger, frost, loneliness, and waiting. So, let's find out why medieval winters were brutal, in the slowest, coldest, most quietly difficult ways, and how people, somehow, just kept going. Let's start by subscribing. The very first snowfall didn't come with cheer. No carols, no jingling bells. It came with silence, a strange quiet that crept over the village like a heavy blanket. Birds stopped singing. The dirt roads hardened. The wind began whispering through the cracks in the wood, as if testing the strength of every home. The people knew what was coming, and yet it never got easier. As winter approached, the air became sharp. The sun dipped earlier and earlier, until the whole world seemed to shrink by afternoon. Children were called inside, tools were packed up, and the fields, well, they went to sleep. And not a peaceful sleep, more like a long thin breath that stretched from November all the way through March. A peasant's home was small, a one-room cottage, often made from wattle and daub. That's mud and sticks if you're wondering. With a thatched roof, barely strong enough to hold the snow that piled up each night. Inside, just a hearth, a bench, maybe a straw bed stuffed with feathers, if they were lucky. But here's the thing you might not expect. There were no chimneys, just a small hole in the roof. And that meant the smoke from cooking fires stayed in the room for quite a while before finally drifting out. It made the walls black, and the air thick. But it was warm, and warm was worth everything. You'd find whole families sleeping on that bed. Mother, father, children, and sometimes, even the goat. Not out of love, no, out of survival. The body heat helped. Every bit of warmth was borrowed, from wool blankets, from a sleeping dog, even from the stones that had been heated in the fire and then wrapped in cloth to be placed at the foot of the bed. And yet it was never really warm. You might think, why not just light a big fire? Here's the thing. Firewood wasn't free. It took time, effort, and permission to gather it. In fact, in many places, forests belonged to the lords or the church, and peasants could be punished for taking wood without approval. So most families rationed their fuel like gold. That meant only one fire a day, maybe two if someone was sick, and usually just enough to cook porridge, or boil water, or keep a weak flame alive for the evening. You could hear it, the crackling, soft, tired flames, and nothing else. Outside, the wind howled like it was angry. Inside, everyone tried to stay still, because moving meant letting in cold. The meals, simple. Porridge in the morning, and again in the evening. No spices, just oats, water, and sometimes a tiny bit of honey or fat, if the family had saved some. Root vegetables like turnips and onions were stored in cellars, but even those were rationed. Meat, rare. Salted fish, if they lived near a river. And once a week, maybe, a small piece of dried meat that had been hanging above the hearth for weeks. Still, the food was warm, and that mattered more than flavor. But the real struggle wasn't always hunger. It was time. Time stretched in winter. Without crops to tend, and with travel nearly impossible due to mud, ice, or snow, the days became long. The nights became longer. You'd wake, feed the fire, eat, maybe repair tools, spin thread, sharpen a knife, and then, wait. Read the Psalms if you could. Whisper a prayer, then sleep again. Even talking became rare, not out of sadness, but because everyone was too tired, too cold, too quiet. Some homes had shutters, but many did not. Windows were covered with oiled parchment, not glass, letting in only a blurry glow of daylight. At night the moon and stars tried their best, but it never felt like enough. The dark became a part of life. Imagine lying in bed, the fire barely embers now, listening to your father's breathing, your sister's cough, and nothing else, just the wind scraping against the door. And knowing that it would be like this again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. But even in all this, life went on. Children still laughed, under blankets, during stories told by candlelight. Grandmothers hummed old tunes from their youth. Some villagers carved tiny animals from bits of bone, or made dolls from scraps of cloth. Little distractions, from the cold. People found calm inside the hardship. It's strange, right? To think that in this harsh, freezing silence, there was still peace, there was still rhythm. And when it snowed, truly snowed, the world outside looked almost magical. The black trees, the white fields, the footprints left by early risers collecting water. Everything looked frozen in time. Water, by the way, wasn't from taps. Oh no. It had to be drawn from wells, or carried from a stream, often with hands already numb. The water had to be boiled to be safe, and sometimes it was flavored with herbs just to taste a little better. Children helped. They always helped. There was no such thing as idle youth in winter. Everyone did something. Even walking required work. Boots weren't common. Many wrapped their feet in cloth, or wore old shoes lined with straw. And yet you'd see them, trudging through snow, bent over, carrying firewood or buckets. And every breath they took, you could see it rise and fade in the cold air. Even animals had their own winter rituals. Chickens were kept close, often inside the house. Cows and pigs stayed in barns that smelled of hay and warmth and life. Their bodies gave heat too. And if a cow gave milk in winter, that was fortune, that was comfort. A warm bowl of milk could feel like a feast, but nothing compared to the ritual of lighting the fire at dusk. As the sun vanished, the fire was rebuilt, fed with twigs and dried leaves, then small logs, and as the flames grew, so did the comfort. People sat in circles. They didn't talk much, they just existed, together, quiet, safe, for a while. And above them, the rafters caught shadows, and the snow outside fell like whispers. You can almost feel it, right? Not fear, not pain, just cold, slow, real life. That was winter for most people in the medieval world. Not always suffering, not always horror, but always a kind of challenge, wrapped in silence. The silence that taught patience, that taught gratitude for the smallest things. A warm bowl of soup, a quiet night, a shared blanket, the sound of someone still breathing beside you when you woke. And though they may have shivered, they didn't give up. They just waited, together. Because in the medieval world, you didn't conquer winter, you endured it. There was something kind of rhythmic about the way winters moved through a medieval village. Each day looked almost the same, but every small change, every new sound or scent, told its own quiet story. Like the creak of the door at sunrise. Not from someone leaving, but someone peeking out, just to see if the snow had stopped, or if the frost had formed strange patterns on the woodpile again. Frost. It came like lace, covering the world with tiny crystals, the kind you could rub away with your finger, but wouldn't, because it looked so perfect. Sometimes a child would run out barefoot just to step in it, just to feel it, even if just for a second, before getting called back inside. Their little feet red and stinging, but their smile wide, because they'd felt the winter. And somehow, that mattered. By the second month of winter, the food became thinner. The salted fish grew fewer. The pickled vegetables were soft. The bread, harder. Bread was everything. Made from rye, barley, sometimes oats. Wheat was rare. Too expensive. It wasn't soft or fluffy either, but dark, dense, and chewy. And sometimes, there were more seeds and dirt than flour. But still, it filled the belly. And filled meant survival. Villagers would slice bread thin, and soak it in broth to soften it. A kind of quiet trick to make it last longer, and feel warm going down. And if there was cheese, that was luck. A hard yellow block from last summer's milk. It tasted sour, but strong. Like something you could trust to stay with you through the night. In the evenings the villagers told stories. Not the kind we tell today. No dragons or witches. Well, sometimes witches. But more often they told stories about weather. Yep, storms that shook the church tower. Snows that buried fences. Icy winds that blew the thatch clean off someone's roof. Everyone had their own version. And they always swore it was true. You'd hear, "Oh, it snowed so high it covered the window." Or, "We burned shoes when we ran out of wood." Everyone nodded. Everyone added their bit. And no one really cared if it was true. Because it made the room warmer. Made the silence softer. And speaking of wood. Every twig mattered. Children were sent out to collect sticks. Small, broken branches. Even on the coldest mornings. Sometimes they walked for an hour, wrapped in 2 thin cloaks, just to fill one small basket. You might think that's cruel. But no one complained. It was normal. And when they came home, cheeks bright red, hands shaking, the sound of that basket hitting the ground felt like a gift. Even wet wood was welcomed. Because wet could dry, dry could burn, and burning meant soup. But sometimes, the wood ran out. That's when things got, creative. People burned dried animal dung. Yes, it worked. It smelled well, not great. But it burned slowly. And slow was good. Others burned old furniture. A broken stool. An extra plank. A wheel no longer turning. Everything had a second purpose in winter. Nothing was wasted. Even ashes were saved. To clean floors, scrub pots, or make lye for soap. Soap. Now there's something you probably didn't expect. Most people bathed rarely, especially in winter. Water was cold, and bathing could make you sicker, not cleaner. But still, they cared about being somewhat clean. They'd wipe down with cloth soaked in vinegar, or warm water. Rub their hands with rosemary, or lavender, if they had any. And of course, smoke from the fire seemed to cover every scent anyway. Then there were the church bells. Even in winter, they rang. Soft, slow, steady. They marked the hours, the prayers, the holy days. Sometimes a bell was the only sound for hours. Just one note, cutting through the cold. When you heard it, you didn't think about time. You thought about the fact that someone, probably the priest, had walked through that freezing air, just to pull that rope. Just to remind you, the world was still turning. Even if it felt frozen. Now let's talk about clothes. What did people wear to fight the cold? Well, layers. Lots and lots of layers. First, they wore a linen undertunic. Then a woolen tunic on top. Then a cloak. Then maybe another cloak. Socks were wrapped fabric. Shoes were stiff leather. Barely waterproof. There were no zippers. No buttons. Just laces, cords, and sometimes, nothing at all. They tied what they could. The rest? They tucked and hoped for the best. Wool was the hero of winter. It was scratchy, sure, but it stayed warm even when damp. And a cloak made from thick homespun wool could last for years. Women often wore quiffs, cloth hoods that covered the head and tied under the chin. Men wore caps, simple ones. Children wore hand-me-downs, often too big or too thin, but patched with love. And gloves. Rare. Most worked with bare hands. Cold hands. But no one really complained, because they didn't expect comfort. They expected cold. There were some stranger solutions too. People stuffed straw into shoes, laid straw across floors, even slept on straw. It trapped warmth, and made things feel softer, at least for a while. Sometimes they hung heavy cloth over the door to keep out drafts, or nailed old blankets over windows. It didn't fix the cold, but it helped. And in that world, helped was enough. Now, let's wander to the manor house. Because while peasants lived simply, the lords weren't exactly living in luxury either. Not in winter. Yes, their homes were bigger, made of stone, but stone is cold. Very cold. They had larger hearths, more firewood. Sometimes they even had tapestries hanging from the walls. Not just for decoration, but insulation. But even the lord's bedchamber was chilly. Big beds, tall beds, with curtains all around to trap heat from bodies. Sometimes they'd warm the bed with heated pans. Little trays filled with coals, slid between the sheets before bedtime. Servants did that job. Carefully, quietly. Still, even the rich shivered. There was no escaping it. And with the cold came sickness. Coughs, fevers, aches that wouldn't go away. No antibiotics. No doctors, really. Just herbal teas, warm cloths, and hope. Sometimes a local healer would visit. She'd bring dried mint, or sage, or chamomile, make poultices, whispers, prayers. But mostly people just endured it. Some got better, some didn't. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even seen as unfair. It was life. But here's something beautiful. In all of this, in the coldest, quietest months, people still found joy. They sang. They carved. They told riddles and jokes by firelight. They listened to the wind in the trees and guessed which direction it came from. They watched their breath rise in little clouds and tried to blow shapes. They counted icicles. They named snowflakes. They rested. They waited. And they dreamed. Dreamed of the thaw. Of muddy fields. Of spring onions. And the first eggs. Of long walks and open windows. And sunlight on skin. Ah, but that was far off still. First they had to survive the midwinter. And midwinter, was always the hardest part. The hardest part of winter. That middle stretch, when the snow had already fallen, again and again, when the nights felt longer than days ever had. And yet spring was nowhere in sight. People stopped talking about when the snow would end, and started asking if it ever had. They watched the rooftops, not for beauty now, but for collapse. Ice weighed heavy on thatch. A weak beam, one soft corner, and down it would come. A soft crash, a slow creak, and a quiet panic that followed. They patched what they could, hammered with frozen fingers, laid new straw, tied rope where nails had failed. A roof in winter wasn't just a roof, it was everything. Inside those homes, families drew closer than ever, not just for warmth, but for silence. There's something about being cold, tired, and still alive. It makes you listen more, to the fire, to the wind, to each other. You'd hear someone whisper, "Did you hear that?" Or, "I think the mice are in the grain again." Mice. Yes. Winter was hard on animals too. They slipped into homes, chewed through bags of flour, and scattered crumbs across floors. But no one blamed them. How could they? Even the smallest creature needed warmth. Sometimes families left out a few scraps, just to share. Not out of kindness, maybe, but from a deep sense of fairness. As if the cold had made everyone equal. Animals. Let's talk about them. Pigs, cows, goats, chickens. They didn't do well in winter. Most barns were unheated, just wooden walls and straw. If you were lucky, the animals made enough warmth for each other. But if one got sick, the rest followed fast. The cow was life. It gave milk, pulled plows, and when it died, fed the family. So losing a cow, that wasn't just loss, it was grief. Some villagers slept in the barn just to keep them warm. They curled beside them, shared breath, prayed the straw would be enough. It wasn't romantic, it was desperate. And that desperation had its own kind of courage. Now if you wandered through a village during deep winter, you'd hear less laughter, fewer footsteps, just the creak of snow under boots, the caw of a lone crow, the wind slipping between wooden slats. But if you walked past a window and looked in, you'd see small glows, a candle flickering in a clay holder, a mother spinning wool by firelight, a child tracing frost on the glass with their finger, over and over, until it melted under the warmth of their skin. No one called it boredom. It was just winter. And speaking of candles, let's light one, slowly. There. It was tallow, made from fat, rough, smoky, smelled a bit like stew left too long on the fire. But it gave light, and that was priceless. Beeswax was better, sweeter, cleaner, but rare, saved for churches, or the very rich, so tallow it was. They made them in bundles, hung them to dry, lit them carefully. A candle didn't just mark time, it was part of time. Some families measured a whole evening by a single candle's burn. When it was gone, bedtime, even if no one was tired, because sleep too was different in winter. You see, most people didn't sleep all night in one stretch. They had first sleep and second sleep. They'd go to bed after dark, sleep a few hours, then wake up quietly in the middle of the night. Some prayed, some made tea, some told stories, or whispered things too soft for daytime. Then, after an hour or two, they drifted back into their second sleep. No alarms, no pressure, just the rhythm of the cold. And tea. Well, not tea like we know it. They boiled herbs, nettles, mint, dandelion roots, even bark, anything that smelled different from plain water. They drank it from wooden cups, slowly, not because they loved the taste, but because it was warm. And in winter, warmth was everything. Sometimes they added honey, if they had any left from summer, or a pinch of salt, to fight off dizziness. Children didn't go to school in the snow, not most of them. Only the richest learned to read. The rest learned from life, like how to dry their socks near the fire without burning them, how to carry water without spilling it, how to listen for the sound of breaking ice, just before it broke. And yet they played. They found joy in small things. They shaped snowballs with gloved hands, slid across frozen ponds on flat pieces of wood, laughed when they fell. Some carved little toys from leftover firewood. A horse, a dog, a simple cube. Others made dolls from cloth scraps and twine. No batteries, no screens. But somehow those toys held magic, because they were made in winter, with cold fingers, and warm hearts. And yes, sometimes, The cold was too much. Someone's grandfather got sick and didn't wake up. A baby cried too long and too soft. A mother wrapped in too little wool just couldn't make it to spring. When these things happened, the village didn't scream. They whispered, they gathered, they dug in the frozen ground, slow quiet work, and laid their people to rest with pine needles and tears that froze before falling. Grief in winter was heavy, but it wasn't loud. Still, the people carried on, because winter demanded it, and in some strange way, that gave them purpose. You got up because the chickens needed feeding. You fetched water because the barrel was almost empty. You chopped wood because no one else could. You kept the fire going because if you didn't, the house would go cold. And with it, everything else. Fire became more than fire. It became a person, a companion. They fed it, tended it, spoke to it, and in return, it stayed, it danced, it whispered back, not in words, but in cracks and pops and the smell of pine. Some nights, people didn't speak at all. They just sat, one beside the other, watching shadows flicker on stone walls, letting time drift, letting breath slow, letting the cold knock gently at the door, but never quite enter. Then came February. Ah, February. Snow still on the ground, but something different in the air. The way a crow cawed from the trees, the way the icicles melted just a little faster. The sun rose a touch earlier, and lingered a little longer. And that small change, it meant everything. People began to talk about spring, not like it was real yet, but like it might be. They began to check on their tools, their plows, their spades, their baskets. They opened their seed jars, counted what was left, wondered if it was enough. Children were sent out to look for the first green shoots. And when one was found, the whole house smiled. Even if it wasn't edible, even if it was just a weed, it meant life had remembered them. The river began to crack and shift, not fully thawed, but murmuring. Soft splashes between frozen shores. And the animals, they knew. Goats bleated louder. Chickens stirred more. Cows pressed noses to doors. They could smell the thaw. They wanted sun on their backs. They wanted to walk, stretch, eat fresh grass. And the people, they wanted the same. But winter still had teeth. There would be one more storm, one last heavy snowfall, one final test, and they knew it. So they prepared, carefully, quietly, because the end of winter was still winter. That final storm, it always came when no one wanted it. Just when fingers had started to thaw. Just when the chickens had begun to peck the frozen earth again. And just when children were leaving footprints where grass had almost returned. The sky turned dark again. The clouds grew low and heavy, like wool soaked in sorrow. And snow fell, not like a whisper, but like a warning. That last snow was quiet, but not gentle. It blanketed roofs, slid across the ground in waves, froze water in the buckets already filled for the next day. You could hear people sighing as they looked outside, not because they were surprised, but because they had hoped. Still, they knew what to do. They always did. Old blankets were stuffed into window cracks again. Doors were reinforced with hay. Boots were dried and checked. Fires fed until the hearthstones glowed. It was like preparing for a guest no one wanted, but who came every year anyway. They had names for this storm: the black lash, the hunger snow, the widow's wind. Names passed down by mouths no longer living, but remembered, because everyone knew, if you made it through this snow, you would make it through winter. So they braced. No panic, just understanding. Even the animals sensed it. The barn went silent. The dog curled near the hearth, refused to stir. Even the cat stopped pacing. That night, candles burned longer. Not for light, but for comfort. You see, light in the darkness means something more in a storm. It's like holding hands with the world. By morning, everything was white again, like it had never thawed at all. The footprints, the signs of spring, even the faint marks of wagon wheels, all gone. But inside, life kept going. There was always something to do. Have you ever mended a boot by firelight? It's slow, threading stiff leather through older leather, fingers pricked, knots tightened with your teeth. Or maybe darning socks, pulling old wool from an unraveling sleeve just to fix the toe of something else. The goal wasn't beauty, it was survival. And every stitch was a promise to see spring. And oh how they talked. Not loud, not hurried, but those slow winding conversations that meandered like a river in the frost. Remember the spring when the river flooded? Do you think the bees made it through? Will the elder tree bloom again this year? Stories helped. Always stories. Tales of past winters. Of winters worse than this. Of how someone's great uncle once ate tree bark and survived. of how, long ago, a candle burned for 10 nights and no one knew why. And songs, soft ones, lullabies that no longer made sense, words passed down with no clear meaning, but every tone felt like home, like warmth, like memory. Sometimes they hummed without words at all, just long, slow notes that made the walls hum with them. Music didn't need reason in winter, it just needed breath. Outside, the snow thickened, trees groaned under weight, icicles grew so long they tapped the windows when wind blew. Still, some had to go out, to chop wood, to check the roof, to feed the animals. They walked slowly, not because of the cold, but because each step could be the wrong one. Snow covers danger. It makes wells look like hills. It hides holes, sharp tools left behind, and the gentle slope of roofs just about to collapse. So, they walked carefully. They listened. Even their breath seemed louder against the hush of snow. Inside, the fire was kept alive like a heartbeat. Even the smallest ember mattered. They used bellows to stir it, blew gently when it faded, shielded it with bodies when doors opened. If it went out, well, it was more than just cold. It was danger. Fires weren't always easy to restart. Kindling had to be dry, but dry things didn't last long in winter. So people hid tinder under beds, inside hollow logs, in clay jars, anything to keep it just a little safe, because fire was life. The food, yes, let's talk about that. By now the stores were low. Grain was nearly gone. Root vegetables had started to rot, even in the cool dark cellars. Carrots turned soft. Turnips sprouted tiny green hairs. Onions began to shrink. And yet, they were precious. They cut off the bad parts. They used every bit. Peels for broth. Tops for flavor. Even the water they boiled them in was saved. For soups. For warmth. For soaking hard bread. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be. Sometimes, they scraped the bottom of the flour jar with a spoon, hoping for enough to make one more flat cake. And if they didn't have enough, they shared. A neighbor would knock softly, leave a bit in a wrapped cloth. No words, just a gift left on the doorstep. Because winter didn't belong to one family. It belonged to everyone. And when it became too quiet, too heavy, they looked at the sky. Always the sky. They watched how the snowflakes changed, from heavy to small, from crowded to drifting. And then, a flicker, a beam of light through the clouds, soft gold on the snow. And just like that, they knew. The storm was ending. Not over maybe, but ending. The next day you could hear things. The snow dripping, the crack of branches letting go, the slow creak of doors being opened again. And from the houses, laughter. Not loud, but real. A child's voice echoing between walls. A dog barking at something half-buried. Footsteps returning to paths made weeks ago. It was like waking up from a dream. One long, white, quiet dream. And even though it was still cold, the worst had passed. That final storm had come. And they were still here. And so, people began to prepare again. But this time, not for survival. For growth. They boiled water, poured it over packed soil, and tried to warm the earth. They hung up wet cloaks to catch the breeze. They cleaned the inside of their homes, sweeping ashes, fixing chairs, patching holes in the roof from the storm. Not because everything needed to be fixed now, but because it meant spring was possible. You don't sweep the floor unless you believe someone will walk across it again. The birds returned first. Sparrows. One or two at first, then more, landing on fences, pecking at what little was exposed, singing. Yes, singing. Their songs were the true signal, not the snow melt, not the buds on trees, but birds. People heard them and knew. It was time. Time to breathe again. Time to open windows. Time to plant, to stretch, to live outside of firelight. And the smell of it. The smell of earth. Cold, yes, but alive. That smell drifted through the village like a blessing. Even children paused. They didn't know what they were smelling, but they knew it was good. Soon after, the ice broke. The river sighed. It bubbled, cracked, rushed, and suddenly the village had sound again. Real sound. Water. Movement. The sky seemed wider. The trees taller. Even the wind felt less sharp. That's how medieval people knew it was over. Not with a date, but with a feeling. The feeling that the world was waking up, and it had remembered them. And when the earth woke up, it didn't rise quickly. It stretched. Gently, slowly, like a sleeping child in warm blankets. You could feel it in the ground first. Soft. A little damp, like bread dough rising after hours in the dark. That's how spring came. To the medieval village. Not with songs or flowers, but with soft mud, sticky paths, boots that sank a little deeper than before, People knew this stage well. They had a word for it. Not in books, not in writing, but something they muttered when stepping outside. Muck season. Ah, the joy of mud. It sounds strange, doesn't it? But to them, it was the most beautiful thing. Because you can't have mud without thaw, without melt, without the sun returning. And that meant the world had remembered them again. The first task, gathering. Wood, stones, tools lost in the snow. A dropped axe, half buried like treasure. A copper pot, bent from the cold, forgotten under a lean-to. They walked carefully, retracing old paths, looking for what winter had hidden. And it always left something behind. Some of it useful, some of it broken, but all of it part of life. Next came the gardens, or what used to be gardens. Now they were squishy, uneven patches of brown. But they held promise. You could smell it. Even through the rot, even through the damp, the smell of something waiting. Old peasants, the ones with bent backs and missing teeth, would touch the soil with their fingers and smile. Because they felt it. Life. Even now. Especially now. They began with rakes made from bundled twigs, pulling back layers of leaves and ice, letting air in, letting the soil breathe again. You might wonder why that mattered. But when the earth can breathe, so can you. They planted simple things first. Peas, beans, barley if they had any left. Not because they expected harvest right away, but because it was the act of planting that healed them. Each seed was a wish, a soft, silent hope whispered into the mud. The days grew longer. Slowly, 1 minute at a time. They noticed it most during evening chores. You see, during winter, milking cows felt like groping in a cave. You couldn't see your hands, your breath puffed like fog, and everything was stiff. But now, there was light. Just a little. Enough to see the steam rising from the milk pail. Enough to notice the cow's eyes blinking lazily at you. Even the animals had changed. The sheep moved more. The chickens clucked again. And the dogs, oh the dogs, they barked at nothing. Just because they could. Inside the homes, changes came too. Fires were smaller now. No longer roaring for survival, just flickering for warmth. Blankets were folded and put away. Shoes were left near doorways again. People lingered. They stood outside a little longer. They stretched. They let the sun hit their faces without blinking. Some even smiled. And with the sun came stories. Not the ones whispered for comfort, but the ones shared with laughter. Remember when the goat got stuck in the chimney? Did you see old Marta fall in the snow hole again? Did anyone ever find that lost mitten? They talked and laughed, and remembered that life was not just about surviving. It was about being. Of course, it wasn't all joy. The thaw revealed hard truths. A cracked roof that must be mended. A broken wall from shifting frost. A flooded cellar filled with sour-smelling water. Things that had to be fixed. Even if hands were tired, even if spirits were slow. But they did it, because that was the rhythm. Winter breaks, spring mends, summer feeds, and autumn prepares. Then, winter again. The great circle. The circle. It gave people comfort, because even when life felt hard, it was never new. Everything had happened before. Everything would happen again. One of the last signs of the season changing was a sound. Not from people. Not from animals, but from the trees. They dripped. Yes, they dripped. Sap. Sticky, slow, sweet sap. From the birch. From the maple. Tiny drops that caught the light and clung like jewels. Children would taste it. Just a finger pressed against the bark. A lick. Eyes wide. It tasted like sunlight. Like sugar. Like something magical hidden in plain sight. Imagine being a child again. Tasting the forest's tears and smiling. That's what spring was in the medieval world. A season of small magic. And then came the birds. You might remember we spoke of them before. But now, they stayed. They didn't just fly over. They nested. Tiny cups of twigs and moss, tucked in corners of thatch. In barn beams. In hollow trees. Their songs were no longer searching. They were home. And when birds make home, people do too. Markets opened again. Not grand. Not loud. Just a few carts. Some herbs. A bit of cloth. Eggs traded for cheese. And then came the water. Water. You'd think, after so much snow, there would be plenty. But no. Snow didn't always mean full wells. Some had frozen deep and cracked the stone inside. Others had collected dirt and animal droppings in the thaw. So people gathered around ponds and rivers with buckets. Big ones, little ones. Some made from wood slats bound with iron, others just leather sacks with handles stitched on. They carried water carefully, because even in spring, it could make you sick. Sometimes it did. That's why they boiled it, or added herbs to clean it, or said quiet prayers over it. And it wasn't just people who needed it. No, animals needed it more. Chickens fluffed themselves and dipped their beaks fast. Cows stood patient, then slurped with slow gulps that made a sound like peace. Horses drank and then snorted, water dripping from their whiskers like melted icicles. Inside the homes, other changes were underway. People began opening windows again. Not wide, just a crack, enough to let in a bit of the world. Let the smoke drift out, let the new air drift in. And with it came smells. Oh yes, smells. Not just mud or smoke now, but green things, leaf buds, wet moss. And once, just once, someone swore they smelled apples. Not real ones, of course. Just the memory of them. Isn't it strange how spring can make you remember things you haven't seen in months? With water and light and movement came food. Not a feast, not yet, but things grew. Little shoots pushing through the earth. Herbs, dandelions, onions that had slept all winter, now peeking up like shy children. And mushrooms, big soft ones growing near old logs. Not all were safe, but they knew which ones were. They passed that knowledge down, not with books, but with hands. This one, yes. This one, no. Never touch the one with the red hat. They gathered, cooked, shared. Mostly in pots. Heavy black iron ones, set over gentle fires. Simple broths, greens and roots, salt if they had it. Maybe a bit of dried meat from the winter stores. It wasn't rich, but it was warm. And warming food is healing food, especially after a season of cold. The children played more now. They laughed louder. Their clothes were still patched, their shoes still worn thin, but their voices, full of light. They chased chickens, balanced on fences, poked sticks in puddles, and watched clouds like they were ships on a calm sea. The adults didn't stop them. They let them run, because running children are signs of life. At night the houses felt different too. They didn't need fire all the time, just enough to keep away the chill. Blankets were lighter, candles burned longer, not because the dark was scary, but because people stayed up, talking, knitting, sharpening tools, telling stories, not of ghosts, not of monsters, but of things they hoped for. Maybe we'll have enough flax this year. I think the bees will come back. If the apples bloom, we might make cider again. Hope. But because he felt it. The shift. And when the rooster crows, you listen. Even if you're still sleepy. Even if you wish you weren't already late to the day's chores. You get up. Because the rooster doesn't lie. Outside the village paths were less sticky now. Still wet, but drying. People didn't just walk. They wandered. A little farther each day. To check the fields. To visit a neighbor. To stand near the chapel and just breathe. Some went to the forest edge. Not inside. Not yet. But close enough to smell pine. To hear the creaking of branches. To wonder what lived beyond the green wall. And what would come back soon. Deer. Boar. Foxes. All part of the world. Waking up. One day a girl saw a bee. Just one. Buzzing near a crocus. She watched it. Eyes wide, barely breathing. And blossoms meant honey. And honey. Honey was more than food. It was medicine. Treasure. Memory. Imagine going an entire winter without sweetness. And then watching it fly on tiny wings. Soon other things returned. Traders. Not many, but enough. A cart with cracked wheels. A man with a crooked smile selling needles and thread. A woman with herbs tied in bundles. Smells dancing around her like stories. They brought news too. Of towns where snow still fell. Of a king's tax raised again. Of a noble's child, born under strange stars. People listened, and then went back to digging. Because stories didn't plant seeds, hands did. And then came the sheep, soft, still shaggy from winter, but moving in gentle herds. Their bleats filled the air. They were sheared slowly, carefully. Wool was precious. It was warmth for next year. But first it had to be cleaned, washed, combed, spun. Weeks of work, done by hands that knew every step by feel, not sight. Some wool was dyed, with berries, with roots, colors that looked like earth, like sky, like moss, not bright, but kind, comforting. You'd see shirts of soft green, cloaks of gentle gray, scarves the color of mud, but clean mud, if that makes sense. By now spring was no longer a rumor, it was truth. You could see it, hear it, taste it, even smell it in the dust kicked up by walking feet. And people began to sing again. Not loudly, not together, but as they worked, a hum while digging, a whistle while chopping, a murmur while stirring. Songs without names, but full of feeling. That's how you know people are healing, when they begin to sing. So, that was the rhythm. Work, rest, hope, repeat. Not perfect, never easy, but steady, reliable. And in the medieval world, steady was everything, especially after the brutal hush of winter. And maybe, as they lay in their beds now, the straw a little softer, the air a little warmer, they dreamed, not of castles, not of riches, but of green fields, gentle rain, full bellies, and bees, always bees, because if the bees had come back, then so had the world. The first real rain came on a Tuesday. No one remembered the day by name. They didn't count weeks like we do now, but they remembered the feel. It wasn't a storm, just soft taps, one by one, on thatched roofs and worn wooden planks. And the smell, like wet earth and distant leaves. Not the sharp cold of winter snow, but the sweet kind of damp that makes the ground feel alive again. Children stuck out their tongues, let the droplets hit their cheeks. They laughed quietly, not because it was funny, but because it was real. And in the fields, the men and women looked up too, closed their eyes, felt the water fall on their lashes. For a moment, just a moment, no one moved, no digging, no hauling, just being there, while the sky gave something back. It only lasted an hour, but it was enough. The soil drank deep, the air turned warmer, and the seeds, those tiny things buried just days before, began to think. Not speak, not yet, but whisper. Little roots stretching beneath the dirt, like fingers waking from a nap. It's hard to explain, but people knew. You could feel it through your feet. That night, the houses were quieter than usual, not because people were gone, but because they were listening. Listening to the drip of water off the eaves, the creak of wooden beams drying slow, the soft hush of wind curling through cracks in the wall, and deeper inside, the quiet sound of breath, of sleep. Rain did that. It didn't just feed the earth, it calmed the bones. Over the next days, the world changed faster. Patches of green spread like ink in water, first in corners, near stones warmed by sun, then across hillsides and edges of paths. Even the moss looked thicker now, softer. People began to walk barefoot again, just for a little, to feel the ground under them. The cold was gone now. Not all of it, but the worst. They could tell, by the way their hands didn't ache so quickly, or how their teeth didn't chatter, when they opened the door. One afternoon, the blacksmith stepped out. Just stood there, apron still on, hands black with soot, but eyes wide. He hadn't left his forge in weeks. Too much to fix, too much to make. But now, he just stood, watching the wind move the grass. And when someone asked if he'd finished that plow blade, he just smiled. "Tomorrow," he said, and went back inside. Plowing. Now that was something to see. Wooden plows pulled by oxen with backs like hills. Men behind them, leaning in, guiding the heavy wooden arms through soil that had frozen solid just weeks before. It wasn't easy, but it was beautiful. Rows formed like ribbons across the land, curved and straight, dark brown against green. The smell, rich, earthy, like bread before it's baked. Women followed behind sometimes, dropping seeds, tiny things, some saved from last year, some traded, some just found, each one placed with care, with thought, because every seed was a question. Will you grow? Will you feed us? Will you last until next winter? Spring, you see, wasn't just about beauty, it was about trust. Every bit of effort was a gamble. Every meal eaten now meant one less later, so they rationed, even in abundance. They didn't feast in spring, they planned, but still, they smiled more now. There were smiles during work, smiles while combing a child's hair by the fire, smiles when a goat gave birth to a tiny kid that wobbled like a drunken uncle. Those were good smiles, the kind that stay behind the eyes, even after the lips go still. And the markets? Yes, they returned too. Not the big ones yet, just small gatherings. A cart rolled in with fabrics from 2 villages over. Another brought dried fish from the riverbanks. People didn't have coins, but they had things. Eggs, wool, clay pots, sharp knives. They traded not with gold, but with need. And it worked. It worked better than money sometimes. In one corner, a woman offered songs, not to sell, just to share. She stood by a post, her hands on her hips, and sang a tune that made even the dogs stop barking. No one clapped. No one had to. They just nodded, and went home humming it under their breath. Inside the chapel, a tiny stone one, with moss between each rock, someone lit a candle. Just one. It flickered in the still air. No sermon, no mass, just silence and flame. Maybe someone prayed. Maybe not. But either way, it felt like hope. In one home, the eldest in the village, a man with a beard so long it tucked into his belt, sat near the hearth and carved wood. Not tools, not furniture, but birds. Tiny ones, wings spread, tails flared. He didn't sell them, didn't even give them away. He just placed them on the shelf, one by one, until the whole room looked ready to fly. People asked him why. He never answered, just smiled. Like the answer was too simple to say out loud. As days grew longer, people began sleeping less. Not because they weren't tired, but because they were ready for what came next. The hard work, the growing season, the endless days of bending and lifting and gathering and sorting. It sounds exhausting, doesn't it? But it wasn't. Not then, because after surviving a medieval winter, hard work felt like a gift. There was one night, near the end of spring, when the moon looked like a coin dipped in milk, soft, glowing, round. A group of villagers stood outside, not talking, just watching. One by one, they drifted back inside, heads tilted back just a little longer than usual, like they didn't want to forget it. That moon, that night, that feeling of being alive after everything. And somewhere, not far, a baby cried, its first cry, born just after the moon reached the highest point, and people said, "This one will grow strong. The world is kind again." Maybe they were right. Or maybe they just needed something to believe in. Either way, the baby kept crying, and then it laughed, like it knew the secret of spring, and wasn't afraid to share it. The winds changed again, not harsh anymore, not like knives on skin, but soft, like breath on the back of your neck. It curled around the thatched roofs, slipped through open shutters, and danced over the quiet fields. That's when people knew. It was time to do more than just survive. It was time to prepare. Because in medieval life, spring wasn't rest, it was race. Every warm day had to count. Every tool sharpened, every hand busy, every mouth quieter now, focused on tasks that had to be done before the heat of summer made them impossible. Let's start with the sheep. The sheep. Fat now from winter feed, thick wool hanging from their backs like shaggy blankets. They moved slower, heavier, sometimes lay in the sun, blinking slowly, legs folded neatly. But their time had come too, shearing. And not in factories, not with machines, but by hand, steel scissors, careful fingers. Yup, it took patience. Each snip was a sound like cloth tearing, soft, steady. The wool came off in sheets sometimes, curled and damp, and smelling, earthy, sheepy, warm. They didn't seem to mind. Sheep were funny like that. As long as you didn't tug too hard, they stood still, just blinked. And when it was done, they looked like different creatures. Thin, suddenly, naked, like someone took their coats off too soon. But they were fine. They knew spring meant change. The wool got cleaned next, washed in cold water, beaten gently on wooden boards, picked through by careful hands. Little bits of hay, gone. Tiny bugs, gone too. It was slow, but it was meditative. People often hummed while they worked. Not songs with words, just sounds, like wind through reeds. And by the time they were done, the wool was clean, light, soft, ready to be spun. Now spinning. That was an art. Spindles, fingers, rhythm. The wheel creaked quietly. Like an old lullaby repeating itself. It took hours, but time moved differently when you spun. Like each thread pulled a little bit of yesterday away, and wrapped tomorrow around your hand. While wool was spun, others dug trenches, not deep ones, shallow ditches beside rows of crops, for water. Because April rains were kind, but May could forget. And the crops didn't wait, so they guided water by hand, stone by stone, sometimes cupped it in bowls, and poured it where roots were dry. That's how much each leaf mattered, because without them, winter would return too soon. In the forest edge, the children returned, not to play, always, but to gather. Sticks, mushrooms, nettles, wild garlic. Oh, wild garlic. That sharp smell in the air. That first green on the table, mixed in soup, ground in paste. It woke you up, Inside and out. They said garlic kept the cold away. Maybe it did. Or maybe it just made you feel like the worst had passed. The baker started earlier now. Woke before the sun. Lit his oven with kindling from trees felled in winter. Made dough with the last of the old grain, and the very first grind of the new. He kneaded it slowly, not rushed, because bread made in spring had to last, and the smell, oh that smell drifted out like a story being told without words. It meant things were turning right again. People walked faster past his house, smiled wider, even when they had no coin. Just to smell it was enough. One day, a girl brought a flower. Tiny thing, blue like a faded sky. She gave it to her mother without speaking, and her mother, tired, apron wet, hair messy, just stopped, took it in her fingers, held it like it was gold, and then tucked it behind her daughter's ear. They didn't say thank you. Didn't need to. The silence did that for them. Even the animals felt it. The pigs dug deeper in the mud. The goats climbed higher. The chickens, oh they strutted with pride. Each egg they laid was warmer now. Bigger, richer, the kind of egg that made you believe things would be okay. In the evenings the sky turned long. You know the kind of sky, where the sun takes its time, where gold fades to pink, then purple, then a soft, deep blue. People sat outside more. Not talking, not always, just sitting, letting the cool touch their skin again, letting their lungs forget the smoke of winter fires, and their hearts slow down. Spring did that. It didn't rush, it reminded, and when the night came, they slept better, not because they were less tired, but because the fear had gone, the fear that the cold would come again, that the food would run out, that anyone would fall sick from frost. No, that fear had melted, like ice on a stone path, gone without a sound. One night the blacksmith's apprentice played a flute, a simple one, made of hollow reed. He sat by a tree, eyes closed, fingers gentle, and played a tune no one taught him. It wasn't perfect. Some notes bent, some faded, but no one cared, because it felt true, like the earth singing back to itself. And in the distance, the first fireflies blinked. One, then two, then a dozen, tiny lights in the dark, and the children whispered, pointed, laughed, because they remembered them, from before the snow, before the silence. Now they were back, and that meant something. It meant we made it. The summer was almost here now. You could feel it, in the way the air no longer bit your fingers in the morning, but kissed them instead. Yes, it was softer, gentler, the kind of warmth that didn't make you sweat, not yet, but made your skin loosen, just a bit, and made your muscles stop clenching. They said summer meant rest, but that wasn't really true. Not in the Middle Ages. Not when winter had taught you how fast food could vanish, how quickly your body could forget comfort. No, summer was for filling the shelves again. Let's talk about the fields first. The golden fields. The grain had grown tall now. Not fully ready, but soon. It swayed like waves on dry land. And when the wind passed through, it whispered, like voices calling each other from far off. You couldn't understand the words, but you understood the feeling. Hope. That's what it sounded like. Hope made of wind. The men checked the grain heads, bent them gently, rolled them between fingers, examined the weight. Too soon to cut. Too soft. But not long now. Not long at all. So they waited, sharpened scythes, prepared sacks, talked little, because when the time came, and it would come fast, they had to act. Quickly. Cleanly. No mistakes. The women, meanwhile, were deep in the herb gardens. Yes, the herb gardens. Small squares of earth close to cottages, fenced with sticks, or woven branches. They were precious. Tiny, but full of life. Parsley, mint, sage, valerian for sleep, yarrow for cuts, fennel for the belly. They knew every plant by smell alone. Didn't need names, just purpose. Each leaf meant something. Each root had a reason. They dried them on racks made of willow, hung them upside down inside warm rooms. The scent filled everything. Soft, green, clean. One day a woman picked lavender, wrapped it in a cloth, and placed it near her child's bed. For sweeter dreams, she whispered, and it worked. He slept deeper that night, without shifting, without waking, because nature held him. The rivers were different now too. Less ice, more flow, cool but not dangerous. Children were allowed near them again, with buckets, with hands, to catch fish, frogs and little things that flickered just below the surface, some to eat, some to release, but mostly, just to watch, because watching water in summer is its own kind of magic. It carries you, takes your mind someplace else, someplace quieter. The animals too had changed. The cows gave richer milk, the chickens laid more, the goats wandered farther without fear of snow, and the dogs, scruffy little things, barked less. They dozed in the shade, tongues out, eyes half shut, safe, peaceful. One boy saw a deer, just standing near the tree line, not moving, not afraid. He stared at it for a long time, didn't call out, didn't move closer, just stared. And the deer stared back, then it walked away, quiet as a whisper. That boy didn't tell anyone. He didn't need to. The memory was enough. Inside the kitchens, food had changed too. Soups weren't just turnips and barley now. Now, there were onions, wild garlic, even a little honey, if the bees had been kind. And cheese. Oh, the cheese. Soft white cheeses, made from milk that had just cooled from the udder. Tangy, gentle, rich. They wrapped it in cloth, set it in cool places, sometimes added herbs, sometimes didn't. It didn't matter. It always tasted like sunshine. The old man in the village square started telling stories again. He sat on the same stool, leaning forward, hands open, voice low. No one paid him in coin, but they listened. Every word. He talked about the coldest night he ever survived, how the fire went out, and how his wife covered their baby in every cloth they owned, even the ones she needed, and how in the morning, the baby lived. So did she. But 3 toes on her left foot were never the same. He told it without tears, just fact. And at the end, he smiled, because pain remembered is peace earned. Then the bells rang one morning, not church bells, smaller ones, hung from a cart. It was the peddler, the traveling man, with thread, with spoons, with salt from the coast, and sometimes if you were lucky, sugar. Not much, just a pinch, enough to dust the top of bread, enough to feel like royalty for a second. People traded eggs, wool, even a carved spoon, anything. Because even a small taste of the outside world meant you were alive. You weren't trapped by the cold anymore. There was laughter more often now. Not loud, not foolish, just real, from the belly. Shared between neighbors, between strangers. Because laughter is a plant too. It blooms when the frost dies, and it's always worth waiting for. At night, people slept with their windows open. Not wide, just a crack. Enough to let the breeze kiss their cheeks. To hear the owls. To feel something more than darkness. To feel air that didn't punish. One woman said she dreamed of the ocean. She'd never seen it. But she saw it in her sleep. Waves bigger than the church roof. Smells she couldn't name. Sounds she didn't recognize. She woke up crying. But not from fear, just awe. Some part of her knew. The world was wider than the winter had made it seem. And summer reminded her of that. A little boy planted a single seed. Didn't even know what it was. But he watered it. Spoke to it. Named it. Tom. Not a person's name, just Tom. No one corrected him. No one laughed. And when it sprouted, he smiled like he had created a miracle. Maybe he had. Maybe that's what miracles are. Things that grow when you least expect them. Things that grow, just because you believed they might. Summer didn't last forever. But it felt like a long breath. A good one. The kind that fills your lungs, then lets you float for a while. People didn't speak about winter yet. It was too soon. Too heavy. But they remembered. Not with fear. With respect. Because it had taught them something they didn't want to learn. And now they were alive. Now they were full. Now they were together again. And when the sun dipped low, when the fireflies came back, and when the stars blinked into view like old friends returning from a long walk, they didn't feel afraid. They felt ready. Do you hear that? It's the sound of boots, heavy ones, crunching against the path. Not mud this time, but something drier. Summer had passed. The sky still had color in it. Soft oranges and fading blues. But the wind, the wind had changed again. Just a little. Enough to make the leaves quiver. Not yet falling, but getting ready. In the village the people began their second harvest. It wasn't like the first. The first was loud, rushed, urgent. This one, slower, quieter. They picked berries from hedges, collected apples fallen near the trees. The bruised ones were saved for cider. The perfect ones, they were placed gently in straw-filled crates, laid side by side like little treasures, because, in a few months, fresh fruit would be a memory. And only those sweet apples would remind you what summer ever tasted like. The air at night had bite again. Not painful. Not yet. But enough to make you pull your blanket higher. Enough to make you remember. Winter was walking toward you again. Not running. Just walking. Slowly. Calmly. But never stopping. So people began to prepare. This time they weren't caught off guard. This time they had learned. One woman began to dye wool. Not with fancy colors. That was for the rich. But with what she could gather. Bark. Nuts. Berries. The cloth came out in earth tones. Deep browns. Dusky reds. Soft greens. Colors that looked like they had been born from the land itself. And maybe, she hung them up on wooden racks to dry. They fluttered like flags in a wind that spoke of coming cold. The men were chopping wood again. More than last year. Much more. They didn't laugh like they did last season. No games. No races. Just the thudding rhythm of axe meeting tree. Over and over and over. They knew now. Knew how long a winter could be. How wood could vanish faster than breath in January air. So they worked until their arms ached. Then they worked some more. Because nothing feels safer than a pile of firewood. Not gold, not steel, just logs. How, in the kitchens, something was changing too. Less fresh, more dried. Herbs were packed in jars. Root vegetables were stored in pits. Dark, cool, safe. Salted meats hung above smoky fires. Their scent filled every room. Children asked for tastes. Were told, not yet. Because once the frost came, you'd be glad for every slice you saved. One man built a new latch for the door. Not a big one. Just enough to keep the wind from slipping through the cracks at night. He carved it from oak. Fit it so well, not even a whisper could pass through. When he tested it, his wife smiled. Good, she said. Not with joy. Just peace. Because when the wind howls, a good latch is worth more than 100 prayers. The days grew shorter. The sun didn't linger anymore. It woke late. Slept early. Children counted shadows on the walls. They grew longer, faster. The chickens returned to their coop earlier and earlier. Even the dogs started sleeping closer to the fire, like they remembered something too. Something they couldn't say, but felt deep in their bones. The stars came out clearer, brighter, sharper, as if they knew we'd be watching them more, because in the colder months we always looked up more often, not because the stars changed, but because we had more time to sit still, and more need for something beautiful. Yep, that's the truth of it. One evening a boy found a mouse nest near the barn. Inside, little pink bodies, curled like commas, sleeping, breathing, safe. He didn't tell anyone. He just placed a handful of wool near them, soft, warm, a gift. Because kindness doesn't need words. Sometimes it's just warmth shared, even with the smallest things. The elders began their warnings again, not loudly, not angrily, just gentle words spoken while whittling or sitting on porches. Don't leave your boots wet overnight. Always keep 2 flints near the hearth. Check your neighbor's chimney. One spark can ruin the whole street. They spoke from memory, and memory in winter is a kind of armor. You wrap yourself in it. There were songs too. Not the dancing kind, not the festival ones. These were slower, lower, passed from grandmother to grandchild, sung while peeling apples, or stirring porridge, or tucking someone in. The kind of songs that make your heart feel heavy and safe at the same time. That's a strange feeling, isn't it? Heavy and safe. A young girl began to knit, just learning. She dropped stitches, tangled yarn, got frustrated, but her mother just smiled, taught her again and again, because come January, a scarf could mean the difference between sickness and health, and every loop of yarn was like a wish whispered into cloth. Stay warm, stay alive. One afternoon a storm came early, just wind and leaves, no snow, but it made the whole village pause. Windows closed, candles lit, and for a few hours it felt like winter had arrived ahead of schedule. When it passed, everyone exhaled. But silently they added one more log to their stacks, just in case. The ground started to freeze at night. Just a thin layer, enough to crunch under your boots. And the pond? It shimmered in the morning light. Not solid, not yet, but thinking about it. The geese flew overhead in V's. Their calls echoed like bells made of fog. One old woman watched them from her doorstep, said softly, "They know before we do." Then she went inside, pulled her blanket tighter, and lit the first fire of the season. Not because she was cold, but because it was time. Yep, sometimes the fire doesn't warm your body first. It warms your memory. And so the village grew still again. Not silent, not yet, just quieter. People spoke less, moved slower, looked inward. not out, because when the frost kissed the grass in the morning, and the first true cold wind crept through the valley, they knew it had begun again, but this time they were ready. Snow, not yet deep, not thick, just a quiet dusting. You know, the kind that looks like sugar, sprinkled lightly over the roof, the grass, the steps, and the sound. Ah, the sound of the world when it snows, that soft hush. Like the whole village took a breath, and then forgot to exhale. This was the morning people truly felt winter in their bones. Not just the cold, but the stillness. The way even birds stopped flying. A few boots pressed into the snow before the sun rose. A farmer, off to check the animals. A boy, carrying a bucket to the well. Each step left a print. Each print held a story. And that story was always the same in winter. Survive. Inside one small home, a woman lit the morning fire. She didn't rush. First the kindling, then the larger sticks. She knew the trick. Leave a bit of ash from yesterday. It helps the flame rise, soft and steady. She hummed a low tune, the same one her mother used to hum. It didn't have a name, just warmth. A sound that made the room feel less empty. Her children stirred under blankets. The thickest ones were wool, but the thinner ones were stuffed with feathers. Not fancy, just saved scraps, sewn into layers. One of the children sneezed. The mother frowned. Not angrily, just with knowing. Sneezing in December, that's how it begins. She placed a pot of water on the fire, dropped in dried mint, and a bit of honey. They didn't have much, but, enough. The steam filled the little room. It didn't cure anything, but it made you believe it might. And sometimes belief is just as strong as medicine. Outside, the animals felt it too. The goats huddled together in the barn, pressed against each other, ear to ear. The chickens clucked less. They pecked less. They simply waited. Winter did that, even to creatures that don't speak. They understood the quiet, the way the world whispered instead of shouted. A young boy stepped into the snow. He had wrapped his feet in wool before putting on his boots. It wasn't warm, but it was warmer than nothing. He walked slowly, carefully. Not because he was afraid, but because in winter, even walking became a task you had to think about. Where was the ice? Would the snow cover a hole in the path? Would your boot come off in the mud underneath? His task today was simple. Fetch a loaf of bread from the neighbor's oven. They had shared a batch. One fire for 2 homes. Ah, that was common in winter. Why burn twice? The smell. That smell. Fresh bread, warm crust, yeast and fire and love, all in one breath. He closed his eyes. Not to rest, just to feel it longer. The woman inside handed him the loaf, wrapped in cloth. She said nothing, just smiled. Words weren't needed. Bread was its own language in winter. He walked back slowly, holding the bundle close, not just to protect it, but to steal a bit of warmth from it. That warmth went straight to his chest. Back home they ate in silence. Not from sadness, but from peace. The kind that only comes when your hands are wrapped around a hot cup, and your mouth is full of something that took effort to earn. Each bite was a memory. Each chew, a comfort. The windows had frost on them now, little curls and ferns of ice. Like nature had sent tiny artists to paint while the village slept. A child traced the shapes with their finger, wrote their name backward, laughed. The laughter fogged the glass, then vanished. Like a ghost that smiled, then wandered off again. Later that day, the sun came out. Just a little. It sparkled on the snow, made the rooftops shine like crushed glass. The children went outside, bundled up in too many layers. They couldn't move fast, looked like stuffed dolls. But they didn't care. They made snowballs, stacked little towers, tried to catch flakes on their tongues. They fell often, laughed harder. One boy made a snow angel. The others watched, curious, then joined. A field of white, dotted with wings, not from birds, but from humans, pretending to fly. Back near the barns, a man repaired a broken fence. The cold made the wood crack easier, made metal stiff. His gloves were thick, but clumsy. Still he worked, not because he had to, but because winter didn't stop for broken things. It only made breaking easier. So you fixed what you could, while you could. Evening fell quickly, as if someone had pulled a curtain over the sky. The fire was lit again, brighter this time. The room danced with orange shadows. A girl sat near the hearth, combing her sister's hair. Slow strokes, gentle hands. They didn't speak, but every brush was a story, told without words. Yep, that's how families spoke in the cold months. With care, not conversation. Before bed, the father added 2 more logs to the fire. Just enough. He placed a stone in the coals, let it heat, then wrapped it in cloth, and placed it in the children's bed. It would lose warmth quickly. But that first touch, that first warmth, it was magic. They slept close together, shoulder to shoulder, one blanket shared. Even the dog curled near their feet. Everyone chasing heat. Everyone part of the same small world. Inside those walls, there was safety. Outside, the snow thickened, the wind rose. But inside was fire, bread, wool, breath, and a kind of quiet that felt like being held. You could feel it, even before you stepped outside. That damp chill, slipping through cracks in the walls, creeping under the doors. Another day of winter had arrived. Not roaring, not biting, but soft and stubborn, like a slow fog you couldn't shake off. Inside a nearby cottage, something different stirred. The old woman had finally risen from her bed. Her joints ached, not because she was sick, but simply because she had seen too many winters. She moved with a blanket still around her shoulders, like a queen in her robe. She hummed quietly to herself, a tune with no words, only memory. The room smelled like dried herbs, mint, sage, and the faint mustiness of stored grain. Her hands found the wooden shelf without needing to look. There it was, a jar of preserved goose fat, perfect for rubbing into the knees. She sat by the hearth, lit only by embers now. Slowly she rubbed the fat into her joints, breathing deeply, eyes half closed. It wasn't medicine, but it was something old, something true. Outside, the village boys were gathering something important. Ice. Yes, blocks of ice from the creek. They'd crack them loose with wooden poles, then drag them on sledges up the hill. It wasn't play. They were delivering ice to the smokehouse. Yep, even in winter, the village prepared for leaner days. Salted meat, frozen solid, stacked between straw and thick cloth. You wouldn't believe it, but even when the world was frozen, people still feared hunger more than frost. The boys' breath puffed out in cloudy bursts, their fingers stiff, their noses red, but their eyes still shining. Because working together in cold like that made you feel part of something. Each icy block, a small battle won. At the church, the bell rang slowly, not for service, just to remind the village. It was midday. Even time felt slower in winter, stretching out like a cat near the fire. In the kitchen of a larger house, something smelled sweet. Apples. A mother and her 2 daughters were drying thin apple slices on cloth above the stove. It was one of the rare treats. Slices dipped in honey, laid out gently, turned often. Their hands worked without speaking, but their faces calm, focused, happy, in a quiet way. A simple joy, preserving what little sweetness winter would allow. The father walked in, brushing snow from his coat. He brought news. The snow was thickening near the southern trail. A few wagons had stopped at the edge of the wood. Traders, likely waiting for the wind to die down. That meant there'd be barter. Maybe even a bit of coin. Maybe tonight they'd cook something richer. A stew with more than just root vegetables. Maybe, just maybe, even meat. But no one said it aloud. To say it might jinx it. Instead, the mother nodded once, and set aside a bit more flour for the dough. In the pasture, the shepherd was checking his flock. He moved slowly, boots crunching in the snow. The sheep were huddled, frost on their wool, breath like smoke. He checked each one, not just for injury, but for signs of sickness. Cold did strange things to animals, made them quiet, still. Sometimes that stillness meant sleep, sometimes it meant something worse. He found one lamb lying too still, its eyes half closed. He knelt, lifted it gently, carried it into the shed, wrapped it in cloth, held it near his chest. The warmth of his own body. That was the medicine now. He sat like that for an hour. Didn't move, didn't speak, just breathed. Back in the village, the sky had gone soft again. Gray, heavy, snow falling like ash. Children watched from behind windows, traced shapes in the foggy glass. One girl whispered to her brother, "If you listen hard enough, you can hear the snow landing." And for a moment, they both believed her. Inside another cottage, a man was making candles. He dipped long wicks into melted tallow. Again and again, and again. Each dip added a layer. Each layer made the light last longer. Yep, in winter, light was worth its weight in gold, especially when the nights stretched on forever. His daughter watched, fascinated. She didn't speak, but she counted each dip in her head. And each time the candle grew, her smile did too. Later that afternoon, the snow stopped, and the wind calmed. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt sacred. People stepped outside not to work, just to feel it, to stand still, and let winter pass over them like a song. Old men smoked their pipes. Old women told stories by the fire. Not big stories, just memories. You wouldn't believe how often they remembered what winters used to be like. Colder, or maybe just longer. Sometimes memory plays tricks like that, but no one corrected them. Winter gave everyone the right to remember it their own way. That night, they made stew. And yes, there was meat. The smell filled the house, drew neighbors to the door. They didn't ask for a share, but they lingered, just to smell, to laugh, to share a moment. They brought small gifts, candied nuts, a bundle of kindling. Nothing grand, just the kind of trade winter makes possible. At the end of the night, the snow began again. This time softer. The family sat near the fire, bellies full, eyes heavy. Someone played a fiddle. The tune was slow, gentle, a lullaby for the whole house. And as the fire dimmed, the music faded. The snow danced outside, and the world once again fell quiet. The snow had fallen steadily through the night. Not a storm, not a blizzard, just that slow, persistent sort of snow. The kind that makes everything hush. When the sun rose, if you could call it that, it brought no warmth, just a faint light, spilling like milk across the white-covered world. In one little cottage, the rooster refused to crow. Even the animals could sense that this day was meant for quiet. The family woke slowly, one by one. The youngest curled deeper under the fur blanket. The father sat up and stretched with a soft grunt. The mother stirred the embers. No words were spoken, not out of sadness, but out of, agreement. Today was not for rushing. At the edge of the village, there was a stone wall, not for defense, not really, just a place to mark the end of one world and the beginning of another. Beyond it, the forest, dark, thick, sleeping beneath a heavy blanket of snow. Two boys stood at the wall, brothers, bundled in mismatched wool and leather. They were on a mission, not a grand one, just to fetch pine branches. Their mother wanted to weave more fire starters, so off they went. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Their boots pressed tiny trails into the deep snow, and behind them, silence stitched the trail closed. Deeper into the forest, it felt different. The trees didn't move. The birds were still. Even the wind seemed to tiptoe through. The older boy pointed. There, a fallen limb, rich with green needles. Ah, perfect. They got to work, careful not to break the twigs too loudly, as if afraid they might wake something ancient, something cold. Back in the village, an old man sat carving wood, his hands spotted and stiff, his breath whistling just a bit. He wasn't making anything fancy, just spoons, one after another, each one different, each one the same. You wouldn't believe it, but in some homes, the oldest spoon was the most prized one. Not for beauty, but for all the mouths it had fed. He finished a spoon, held it up to the light. Not perfect, but warm. It would do. He set it on a cloth, reached for another piece of wood. Meanwhile, inside a nearby home, the midwife was preparing something. A tea. Or maybe a tonic. She crushed dried berries, mixed them with nettle leaves, and steeped the blend in a clay pot. There was a woman in labor at the edge of the village. Not ready yet, but close. And winter births. They were tricky. The cold made everything slower. Muscles, breath, time itself. She bundled her supplies, wrapped her own coat tight, and stepped out into the snowy silence. Her footsteps, soft, but her presence, strong. She had done this many times, guided new life into a frozen world. Elsewhere, a hunter was mending his traps. He didn't go into the woods that day, too still, but his hands stayed busy, tying knots, sharpening blades, checking the binding on his boots. His dog lay nearby, nose tucked under tail. Neither of them moved quickly. They knew, some days were for waiting. In the center of the village, something unusual happened. A man arrived, Not a stranger. But not quite a neighbor either. A traveler from the next valley. His cloak dusted with snow. His beard crusted with frost. He carried a letter. Not a scroll. Not a royal missive. Just a letter. Written by hand. Folded carefully. Tied with twine. He handed it to the village scribe. Said nothing. Just nodded once. And left. Inside the scribe's cottage, the fire burned low. The ink on his fingers had faded. But his eyes were still sharp. He untied the twine. Opened the letter. Read it. Smiled. It was a marriage request. A promise of spring. A man asking permission to marry a woman from this village. Even in the deepest cold, life still tried to bloom. The scribe set the letter aside, picked up his pen, and wrote the reply. His script, slow, elegant, careful, no rush. Words mattered more in winter, because they warmed the heart when nothing else could. By evening the snow began again, thicker this time, but still soft. The villagers moved slower, lit more candles, drew their cloaks tighter. At one house a boy sat by the window. He wasn't watching the snow. Not really. He was thinking, wondering what the world looked like beyond the forest, beyond the valley, beyond all this white. His grandfather joined him, didn't ask what he was thinking, just sat. And after a moment said, "When I was your age, I thought the world was flat as the table." The boy blinked. The grandfather smiled. "Turns out it's round, but it still ends where your courage does." They sat together, watching the snow. No more words, just warmth. Night settled again. Fires burned. Candles flickered. Stories floated through the air, like smoke. Nothing urgent, nothing loud. Just winter doing what it does best. Holding the world in stillness. Ah. The wind had changed. You couldn't always feel it on your skin, but you could hear it in the creaking of shutters, the way the trees swayed just a bit slower, or how the crows circled, then vanished. Inside a barn at the edge of the village, a young man was checking on the animals. Not just a chore, a ritual, and maybe even a kind of promise. The goats were huddled together, tiny clouds of breath rising from their mouths. The donkey shuffled slightly, snorting into the straw. The man bent down, ran his hand along the donkey's back. "Still warm," he whispered. He filled the water trough, checked the feed, added a bit of salt to the corner. Something about helping digestion during the cold. His father had taught him that, and his father before that. No books, just quiet memory, passed down like folded notes in a pocket. In the loft above, two girls giggled softly. They were meant to be gathering eggs. Instead, they were telling ghost stories. Not scary ones. Not really. More like stories that made your breath pause, made your ears listen harder, made the barn creak feel more alive. They whispered about the spirit that guards the last snow before spring, about a woman who walks barefoot across the fields, melting frost beneath her steps, about a crow that brings warmth in its wings, only to take it back if it's angered. Silly stories, or maybe old truths, hard to say in winter. The eggs they eventually gathered were fewer than expected. One hen hadn't laid at all. But that was normal. Winter was about doing less, producing less, being still. Even the chickens knew. Back in the village, an elderly woman sat beside a spinning wheel. Her hands were slow but certain. Twist, pull, wind. Wool became thread. Thread became promise. She hummed softly as she worked. Not a song anyone would recognize, just something her grandmother used to hum. Behind her on a low wooden shelf were spindles wrapped in color. Some bright, some dull, but all made from the same sheep, the same hands, the same long winter days. She was spinning not just for herself, but for her daughter. A shawl, to wear during her coming wedding. They hoped for spring, but prepared for snow. Just in case. Outside, the baker was doing something unexpected. He was making bread, in the open air. Not to bake, of course, but to cool. Strange thing how heat rose from fresh bread, even in freezing wind. It was a kind of magic. One loaf cooling at a time, and steam curling upward like a ghost. The baker watched it rise, smiled. "Even the bread has spirit," he said quietly, then carried the loaves inside. In a different cottage, the healer was mixing a balm. Goose fat, marigold petals, a pinch of ground bark. She stirred it gently over the fire. The smell, calming. Not delicious, not sharp, just clean. She would use this to rub sore joints, to warm children's chests when they couldn't stop coughing. It wasn't magic, but it helped. And in winter, help was sacred. Farther away, the smith had taken to doing puzzles. Not the kind you'd buy now, but wooden ones. carved by hand, passed down like spoons or songs. He arranged pieces on the table, grumbling softly when one wouldn't fit. "Ah, bah, always this one," he muttered. But the act calmed him. When you spent your life shaping iron, bending it to will, there was something gentle about trying to fit things together with care. By noon, the snow had stopped. The sky turned a faint, pale blue. Not warm, but light. Children were allowed outside, bundled like stuffed dolls. They tumbled into the drifts, giggling. Some made angels. Some dug tunnels. One boy tried to build a horse out of snow. Didn't work. Still, he tried. And in a way, that was enough. Their mothers watched from doorways. Some knitting, some sipping broth, some simply watching. Winter didn't stop motherhood. It just made it quieter. Later, as dusk approached, one man walked toward the woods. He carried no tools, no bag, just a stick. He wasn't hunting. He was listening. He reached the edge of the forest, paused. The trees stood tall, snow heavy on every branch, shadows long and blue. He closed his eyes, listened, birdsong, wind, a faint creak, maybe a tree settling, or maybe not. Then he turned and walked back, said nothing, but in his heart he carried something, a kind of peace. That night the village was still again. The wind softened, the fires burned low, the bells tied to door handles clinked gently now and then. Somewhere a dog barked once, then went quiet. The moon was only a sliver, a silver thread, barely seen, but it was there, high, cold, still, and beneath it, an entire village, breathing slowly, dreaming gently, surviving winter together. Sometimes winter didn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it crept in, like fog across a sleeping field, like frost gathering at the edge of a window, like silence that arrives before the snow even falls. This day was one of those, the kind that makes you whisper without knowing why. A boy named Alric awoke to stillness. Not silence exactly, but stillness. Even the usual groans of the old cottage had paused. He looked out the tiny wooden-framed window, wiping a patch of frost with his thumb. Everything was white. The road, the well, even the goat's shelter. All gone, hidden under a perfect glowing blanket. It looked soft, but Alric knew better. It would bite your fingers, sting your toes, cling to your clothes like it wanted you to stay. He crept into the main room. His father was already there, stirring something thick over the fire. Porridge, maybe, or beans from the cellar. His mother hummed quietly, braiding her hair. She always braided it the same way, every morning, even when no one was coming, even when the world outside looked like a painting. Routine was their rope in the cold. At the far end of the village, the priest had begun preparing candles, not for ceremony, but for warmth. Old beeswax, melted down from broken ends, stubs, and offering spills. He poured it slowly into carved molds, inserted bits of twine, let them cool along the windowsill. He remembered once being told, a single candle can trick the cold, if you believe in it hard enough. Nearby, a woman was singing. She wasn't trying to be heard. She was just letting it out. Old songs, ones with words that didn't make sense anymore. Ones her own mother had sung while shelling peas or hanging herbs. The kind of songs that keep your hands busy and your thoughts soft. She hung herbs now too, not for cooking, but for protection. Little bundles of dried lavender, rosemary, and wormwood, tied above the door, stuffed in shoes, hidden in corners. Not magic, not really, just memory, woven into leaves. In the carpenter's hut, sawdust clung to the air like snow indoors. He was working on a chair, an old one, fixing the wobble, smoothing the back. He didn't need to, no one asked. But it felt good to repair something, when the world outside seemed too big to fix. Outside, children pressed tracks into the snow like little artists. They made patterns, circles, spirals, lines that led nowhere, on purpose. A tiny girl built a row of snow mice, each with berry eyes and acorn noses. She talked to them softly, gave them names, told them stories of her own. In winter, imagination wasn't just fun, it was survival. At the edge of the woods, an old woman gathered pine needles, not the green ones, but the fallen brown ones, dry and fragrant. She'd crush them later, boil them in water, let the scent drift through her house. It helped the lungs, soothed the mind, masked the damp. In the fields, the snow reached the tops of the hedges. No one farmed now, the land was sleeping. But once a week, the steward walked the borders, even when there was nothing to see. He would press his staff into the snow every few steps, muttering to himself about property lines and land memory. Land forgets you if you stop walking it, he said once. Some believed him. Others smiled quietly. But none told him to stop. There was comfort in his wandering, even if the land was covered, even if no one could see the borders but him. That evening, the wind picked up. Not a storm, not yet, just a warning. Doors were checked, windows stuffed with rags, hinges tested, ropes tied, water drawn. Everyone knew the sound of a wind that meant business. It started soft, then curled under eaves, into keyholes, around boots left outside. Like it was searching for weakness. Inside one home, a woman prepared a drink. Not wine, she made it for her father. He didn't speak much anymore, but when he drank this, his hands stopped shaking. Sometimes he even smiled. Nearby, a young couple sat close together by the fire. She was weaving a scarf. He was repairing a buckle. No words, but the kind of quiet that was full, not empty. Their eyes met now and then. A glance, a breath, a little smile. And somehow, that made the room feel warmer. Far off, in the hills, a shepherd checked his flock. Yes, even in the snow, his sheep were tucked beneath a thicket, protected from the worst wind. He scattered grain, spoke to them softly. They didn't answer, but they listened. Sheep always listened. He sat down on a rock, pulled his cloak around him, and watched the sky turn gray. The stars came late, as if they too were wrapped in clouds. But when they came in thousands. Cold, clear, and blinking like distant thoughts. Back in the village, an elder told a story. One of the old tales. About a crow who stole fire from the mountain. About a boy who chased winter away with a silver drum. About a bear that snored so loudly, it shook the frost from the trees. The children listened, eyes wide, mouths open. They didn't care if it was true. What mattered was that someone was still telling stories. Flickers of candlelight in every window. Steam from chimneys. Snowflakes tapping gently on roofs. And beneath it all, a silence so deep you could feel it in your bones. The kind of silence that, didn't feel empty. It felt safe. Wrapped around everyone like a woolen blanket. A silence that whispered, "You've made it through another day." Ah. So the snow didn't stop. But something changed. You could feel it in the air. Not warmer, exactly. But softer. Like winter was, loosening its grip. People moved a little easier now. Boots didn't crunch quite so loud. Hands weren't shoved so deep into sleeves. And faces began to appear again, uncovered, blinking in the gray morning light. Even the dogs barked more. One of them, a shaggy, lopsided thing with one ear that didn't stand up, trotted through the middle of the village with a sense of purpose. No one knew where he came from. No one knew who fed him. But he was always there, like a cold weather spirit. Children called him Sir Fluff. Adults called him the Beast. He answered to neither. But he made his rounds, padding through the snow like he owned it. Inside one home, a mother kneaded dough. Her fingers were stiff, but her motion was steady. Round and press, fold and turn, again and again. She didn't need to bake bread today. They still had some. A little stale but enough. But the act of baking, that was warmth in itself. Flour drifted like pale dust. Yeast bubbled in a crock by the hearth. The scent of old grain and smoke filled the room. She hummed, softly, almost unconsciously, and for a moment, everything outside disappeared. In the square, the blacksmith had reopened his forge. Ah, yes, finally. The bellows wheezed like a sleeping giant. Sparks danced, metal hissed in water. He wasn't forging armor, or tools, not even horseshoes. Today, he was fixing a spoon. A single spoon, bent near the handle. It belonged to the apothecary. He said it helped him measure powdered herbs just right. The blacksmith said nothing, just nodded, and began. Because in the cold, a spoon, a lock, a hinge that wouldn't squeak. Sometimes fixing something tiny made the day feel survivable. The baker returned from the woods. Not with flour, he had none left, but with birch bark, the kind that peeled like parchment. He'd burn it later. It smelled sweet when lit, like sugar and smoke. People said it reminded them of spring. At the far edge of the village, the midwife gathered moss. Not for a birth, but for fire starting. Moss, when dried, caught flame better than straw. She carried it in a woven bag. Greenish, goldish, soft like fur. She always wore 3 scarves. One for warmth, one for memory, and one for luck. She never said which was which. At the little chapel, candles burned low. The priest had stopped sermonizing. Not because people stopped believing, but because people started understanding that warmth, kindness, sharing were better sermons than words. He simply left the doors open. Let the heat escape. He said it kept the wind from rattling the windows. But truly, he hoped someone cold might wander in and sit, just for a while. That afternoon the snow began to melt from the trees. Not fast, not all at once, but just enough for drips to begin. Little plinks, tiny plops, the sound of change. Not spring, not yet, but the memory of spring. In the hayloft a boy practiced whittling. He carved little animals, a fox, a goat, a deer with legs too long. He lined them up on the beam beside him. No one asked him to carve, no one bought them. But every evening they were gone. He never looked to see who took them. That wasn't the point. Sometimes creating, just for the sake of creating, was enough. An old man sat by the window. He held a clay cup, not with tea, not even with water, just warmth, a hot stone inside. He liked the weight of it. He didn't speak much, didn't go out. But every few hours someone passed his house and waved. He always waved back. Even in the cold, connection matters. One child tied bells to her boots, tiny soft ones, barely audible. She said it made the snow dance, said the snow liked music. And honestly, when she ran through the square, the air really did seem to shimmer. That night, the moon returned, high, pale, glowing softly. It lit up the snow like a lantern under a white blanket. People stood outside, just to look. No words, no need for them, just silence, and stars and snowflakes catching moonlight. One man read aloud to his wife, not a book, they didn't have one, but an old letter, written by her brother, years ago. They'd read it 100 times. Still, it felt new every time. His voice was slow, calm, pausing for words smudged by age. She smiled, because even faded ink can warm a heart. In the field behind the cottages, someone built a circle of snow seats. No one knew who. But the next day, they sat there. A child, a tanner, an old widow, each with a cup of something hot, each wrapped in their own thoughts. They didn't talk, they just shared the space. And somehow, that felt like enough. The cold remained, the snow lingered, but something had changed. People were no longer hiding from winter. They were living within it. Like fish in deep water, slow, still, but very much alive. There was something in the way the wind blew now. It didn't bite, not like before. It brushed, like a tired breath against the cheek. Not warm, but not angry either. A few icicles broke, plink, tink, tunk, falling one by one off thatch roofs and tree limbs. And the sound they made, almost musical, like a frozen chime saying goodbye. That morning, the baker added a small handful of dried berries to his dough. Not many, just enough. He said he found them hidden in the pantry, forgotten during the deep freeze. He didn't sell that bread. He gave it away, slice by slice. First taste of something sweet in a long while, he said with a shrug. And no one argued. The tanner finally opened his shutters, not because it was warm, but because it wasn't too cold, and the air, stale for weeks, needed to leave. Out went the damp smell. In came the gray breeze. Progress. 2 boys repaired the village fence. Why? Because one said it might help the deer come closer in the spring. They tied little red ribbons to the posts. Just a few. Just to make it pretty. They said it was for luck. Whether that was true or not, no one said a word to stop them. In the apothecary's hut, candles burned again. Not just for light, but for scent. Lavender, chamomile, dried mint from last autumn. The smells swirled together, calming, earthy, faint. Even people just passing by outside breathed a little easier. One family patched their cloaks, not because the cold was gone, but because the cold had taught them which spots let the wind in. Mothers sat with children, threading needles slowly. Laughter came from the corners. And not because something was funny, just because it felt good to breathe and be near each other again. The well, frozen since December, made a strange sound, a slow creak, a deep echo. Someone dropped a bucket, and this time it sank. Water, still cold, but moving. The village called it the first thaw. The priest said nothing. He just walked out into the square and rang a small bell. One child ran to him, then another. Then someone brought a stool. No speech, just a simple ring, and a nod toward the sky. And the sky. Not blue, but not fully gray either. Something in between. A pale, honest sky. like parchment left in the sun. The blacksmith sharpened shears, not for cutting cloth or leather, but for trimming hedges. He said the bushes near the chapel would need shaping soon. Maybe not today, maybe not even next week, but soon. And hope? That's worth preparing for. The carpenter, who hadn't spoken in days, carved a flute. Not because he played, but because he remembered someone who used to. He placed it near the chapel door. No name, no explanation, just left it there. A girl collected pebbles from the road. She washed them in melted snow, then placed them on her windowsill. Each stone was a memory, she said, of cold days, of fireside chats, of soups that weren't quite enough, but still made her smile. And with a couple cleared their doorway of snow. Not the whole path, just enough to open the door wide. No one asked why, but that night, several neighbors stopped by, not to visit, just to wave. That open door. It meant something. An invitation to connect. The midwife took off one scarf, the one with green stitching. She folded it gently, and gave it to a boy who had none. No words, just a nod. That scarf had seen more winters than he had. Now it would see more. In the forest, birds started singing. Not loudly, not many, just one or two. Their calls weren't beautiful, but they were real. And real things in winter feel like treasures. A boy tapped on a tree, a maple. He'd heard, if you tapped just right, and the weather was gentle, sap might come. He waited, a single drop, then two. He didn't know what to do with it, but he laughed anyway. It was like the tree whispered, "I'm waking up." That evening, someone left a basket in the square. Inside were dried apples, 2 jars of honey, a pair of woolen gloves, and a note, "Take what warms you." No one knew who left it, but by nightfall, it was empty, and by morning it was full again. The wind still moaned, the frost still lingered, but deep inside, every home, heart and hush, was the quiet certainty that the worst had passed, not gone, but passing. And that was enough. Now the nights, still long, but not endless. When you looked at the moon now, it didn't feel like a distant queen. It felt like a quiet sister, watching, waiting, maybe, whispering. In one cottage, a man boiled pine needles. Not for illness, not this time, just for the smell. It reminded him of walking through woods when the earth wasn't hidden, when soil felt soft, and the wind hummed through branches instead of whipping past them. He poured the pine water into a bowl and left it steaming on the hearth. A mamba. Even scent can be a kind of warmth. The children started drawing again, not inside, but out. Using charcoal bits and old brick shards, they scrawled pictures on barn walls and snow-crusted fences. Smiley suns, lumpy cows, stick people waving. Some adults frowned at first, then smiled, because when the walls start laughing, it means the village is thawing. The ice on the stream began to crack, not fully break, just shift. It made this sound like someone stepping on thin glass. Croak, trunk, but no one stepped near. They just listened. It was like the earth, was breathing again. The women who spun wool moved outside, not far, just by the door. They said the light helped them see better, but truthfully, they missed the open air. Even if it was cold with sky above it. Hav. The beekeeper checked his hives. Still quiet, still sealed, but he pressed his ear against the wood and smiled. A soft hum, faint, steady, like a sleeping song. He didn't open them, didn't need to. That hum meant hope. One man started carving a sled. Not for work, for joy. He said, if the snow stays this soft, the hill behind the chapel would be perfect. He hadn't sledded since he was a boy. He said it was for the children, but people saw him measuring it for his own size. In the tavern, people started talking more. Not shouting, not gossiping, just sharing. Stories, dreams, things they wanted to plant when the soil softened. Someone said carrots, another said lavender. One old man said, "I'll just plant my feet in the sun." Everyone laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was good. The goats gave birth, tiny, bleeding bundles of wobble. Even the grumpiest shepherd cracked a smile. He wrapped the smallest kid in cloth and whispered to it like a lullaby. The sound of new life. It hits different after months of ice. Children raced each other to see who could find the first green thing. Not grass, not leaves, even moss would count. A girl found a single sprout near the well. She didn't pick it, she just pointed. Then they all stood around it for a moment, in silence, like it was magic. Inside the longhouse, someone tuned an old string instrument. The strings creaked, buzzed, wailed at first, then one, soft, clear note. He smiled, then tuned another. A song was coming. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, but he'd be ready. A mother told her children, "Soon we'll sleep with the windows open again." They gasped, as if she said they'd grow wings. "Can we listen to the frogs? Will the stars come in?" She nodded, and for the first time in weeks, they fell asleep smiling. A boy placed stones in a ring near the edge of the field. "A fire pit," he said. "No fire yet," his father warned. "Not yet," the boy agreed. He just wanted it to be ready. Like setting a table long before the meal. A girl collected water in a bucket, then stood in the square and watched it. Watched until the top began to ripple, not freeze. She called it the water test. And every day, the ripples lasted longer. She said that meant spring was coming. And no one argued. The tanner made gloves for no one in particular. Just felt like he should. Wool inside, rough leather outside. Big ones, little ones. He left them by the chapel door. By afternoon, all were gone. The moon began rising a little later. The sun lingered just a breath longer. And someone whispered, "I saw a shadow at supper time." They said it like a miracle. Because light at dinner meant change. One family dug out their cart from the snow. It had been buried for months. The wheels squeaked. The boards cracked. But it still held together. They didn't need it yet. But they oiled the axles, retightened the bolts, hung it with bells. Because maybe, just maybe, they'd travel again soon. And just before the stars appeared, someone found a snowdrop. Tiny, white, nodding gently in the dusk breeze. Not bold, not loud, but there. Proof that even the coldest, harshest winters cannot stay forever. And with that thought, the village slept. Have you ever stood at the very end of something? Not the middle, not the moment when things start to change, but the quiet stretch, right before the world turns its page. That's where the village was now. The air in the morning, it smelled different. Not warm, but not sharp. You could almost taste the dirt waking up. That loamy, sleepy, honest smell, like the earth was, exhaling. Inside the cottages, blankets still lay thick on beds, but no longer reached the windows. Some shutters stayed open, just a crack. Just enough for the morning to peek in and remind everyone, you made it. A child placed a candle by the doorstep, not because it was dark, but because she said the light should greet the new birds, and she was right. By dusk, a robin landed near it, twitched its little head, and sang. Only once, but it sang. The butcher's wife opened her windows to air out the smoked meats. That scent, salty, heavy, warm, drifted down the lane. Someone said it smelled like survival. Someone else said it smelled like a feast waiting to happen. And everyone agreed. The cobbler polished old shoes. Shoes that hadn't stepped past porches in weeks. He buffed them slow, soft, circular. Said they'd need to walk again soon. Said he wanted them ready when they did. By the well, someone left a small wreath of twigs, tied together with ribbon. No note, no words, just a silent, humble circle of enoughness. Of "we're still here." A mother planted a few beans in a pot near the fire. Too early, maybe, but she smiled anyway, because watching something try felt better than waiting for it to begin. For Fijians, the snow no longer covered the whole field, not even most of it, just little patches now, like forgotten scarves dropped by winter. And those patches melted quietly. No drama, no fight, just went away. One night, the wind brought rain instead of frost. It tapped on roofs instead of howling through cracks. It made little puddles instead of icicles. Children watched the water ripple in muddy ditches and whispered, "It's spring pretending." The priest swept the chapel steps, first time since December. He didn't say a word about it, but people noticed, and by afternoon someone had set a jug of fresh water near the altar. Then another left a tiny loaf of bread. Quiet gestures, like brushing the hair of something just waking up. A group of young boys strung bells across the lane. Not loud ones, soft ones, made from bits of metal, coins, old buttons. When the wind moved right, they chimed. No rhythm, no song, just tink tink tink, like winter whispering goodbye. At the edge of the village, a girl set up a little table. On it were stones, twigs, drawings of suns and chickens, and green hills. Her sign said, "Imaginary market, nothing for sale." People passed by and smiled, because sometimes you don't need things, you just need a moment. The forge no longer smoked. The blacksmith said his fire would rest one more week. But his tools? He lined them up, oiled their handles, sharpened their edges. He said, "Soon we'll build again." And that word, it landed like sunlight. Even the dogs were different, less curled, more upright. Their ears twitched, their tails wagged. One chased a melting snowball down the lane, and barked for the sheer joy of it, like his body remembered what movement felt like. A pair of lovers sat outside on a log. No words, no kisses, just fingers laced together. They watched the steam curl from their mugs, and stared at the slush turning to mud. And somehow, it was beautiful. The midwife wrapped her herbal satchel tighter, not for warmth, but because she felt something coming. Births, hope, movement. She had dreams again now. Dreams of warm arms, and open windows, and babies laughing in sunshine. Maybe she was just ready. The stars, they returned. Not the cold sharp winter stars, but the soft ones. The ones that blink. The ones that seemed to smile. And beneath them, the village pulsed, not loudly, but steadily, like a heart rediscovering its rhythm. So when the rooster crowed, just a bit earlier than the days before, no one hushed him, because this time, it sounded like a beginning. So here we are, the end of winter, the edge of something softer, lighter, warmer, but still quiet, still careful, like the world doesn't want to wake too fast. In one cottage, a boy asked his grandmother, "What happens now?" She didn't answer right away, just handed him a warm cup of milk. Then she said, "Now, we remember. Because even as the snow melts, the memories stay. The sound of wind clawing at the shutters. The cold that made bones feel like glass. The nights that stretched so long, it felt like time had stopped breathing. We remember the silences. The ones where the only sound was the flicker of a candle, or the creak of wood. We remember the mornings when getting out of bed was bravery, when fetching water meant dancing with frost. We remember how it felt to run out of flour, and still make something with love. How it felt to miss the sun, so much that even its pale face made your heart ache. A man walked to the edge of the field, where snow still clung to the shadows. He stood for a long time, then knelt, pressed his palm to the thawing ground. He said he was listening. The soil was wet, not soft yet, but not frozen. He said the earth was humming, and the hum said, soon. In the chapel, the candles burned shorter now, not because of fear, but because light lasted longer. People stopped bringing extra cloaks to the pews. Instead, they brought seeds, folded in cloth, tucked in pockets, little packets of future. Someone carved a sun into the doorframe. Someone else placed wild flowers in a broken mug and set it outside the bakery. No one said a word, but everyone noticed. The stream behind the blacksmith's house was running again. Not fast, not loud, but steady. He dipped his hands into it, closed his eyes, and whispered a thank you to the water, to the thaw, to the chance to feel cold in a new way. Children began making mud pies, their fingers filthy, their faces glowing. One girl painted the side of a barn with handprints, bright red, soft green, a splash of yellow. The barn didn't complain. It looked alive. The old woman who hadn't spoken since her husband passed, she laughed, just once, when a chicken landed in her lap. Everyone heard it. No one mentioned it. But that laugh, it was the loudest thing Winter had ever heard. The baker began waking earlier, not because he had to, but because he wanted to feel the sun through the window. He said the dough rose faster now, like even it knew. Winter was loosening its hold. People began to sing again. Not choirs, not ballads, just little hums, while sweeping, while stitching, while hauling water. One boy even whistled, and his father, who hadn't smiled since November, smiled back. At the far edge of the woods, someone found a deer track, fresh, unhurried. They followed it for a while, not to hunt, just to see where it led. It led to a small patch of green, not much, but enough. Enough to remind everyone that survival wasn't the story, recovery was. And so slowly, the village prepared. Not for battle, not for scarcity, but for life. The kind with dirt under your nails. The kind with sweat from planting. The kind that sings softly in the afternoon. The firewood pile, still tall, but untouched now. The soup pot, still used, but not emptied desperately. The doors, open just a crack. Enough to let in birdsong. Enough to let out dreams. One morning, a boy spotted the first butterfly. It wobbled like a drunk leaf. He ran through the lane, arms flailing, voice yelling, come see, and everyone did. And no one was embarrassed. Because wonder is always welcome. At night, they no longer crowded close to the hearth. They spread out. Some sat by windows. Some laid near doors. One man even slept outside. He said he missed the stars kissing his face. And for the first time in a long time, no one asked, will we make it? Because they had. And that question, it didn't live here anymore. A woman stitched the words "we stayed" into a cloth and hung it by her door. Not proud, just true. And when the moon rose on that last cold night, soft, round, gentle, it looked down on a village no longer scared, no longer holding its breath, just breathing. So, if you are still awake, then I think you have to see the video from the 17th minute of the story. Or play this side video, as maybe it can help you sleep better. Goodbye.